This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 582, entitled Gender Political Wars Within Parliamentary Gender Equality Committees, or GECs, GECs. Description. As masculist and MGTOW ideas spread and spread, male masculisted politicians will start pushing for the establishment of true GECs, Gender Equality Committees, in the parliaments that addressed equally the gender issues of both sexes and not just feminist issues, which makes today's GECs, GECs, look like Orwellian doublethink. As general masculist political pressure rises and rises in the general population, these masculist politicians will put real pressure on the monoconscious feminists who currently occupy all the slots of these GECs to give up half of them. Of course, these monoconscious feminist politicians will fight this, so the masculist politicians will need to fight them back. This flyer gives these masculist politicians some intellectual masculist ammo on how to do that. Now the flyer itself. Gender wars within Parliamentary Gender Equality Committees, that's GECs, GECs, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In many of my masculist flyers, I push for the establishment of GECs, that's GECs, Gender Equality Committees, in the parliaments that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally, which is far from being the case today, and hence is one of the great sexual discriminations that exist against men, when women are given all kinds of women's lib attention and help. The problem that I anticipate with the establishment of these GECs is the level of brainwashing of the feminists, that gender oppression is a one-way street that feminism has been preaching for the past 6 decades of its gender political monopoly. The monoconscious feminists are so convinced that men are the sole oppressors and that the sole gender political victims are women, that when they hear from masculists that in fact women oppress men worse due to women's many decades lasting gender crimes against men, they often freak out, going into a catatonic fit of cognitive dissonance, screaming their heads off as their whole psyche rebels against what the masculists are saying, since the image the feminists have been painting for the past 6 decades of women being the victims and men the victimizers is so ingrained, so comfortable, that when the masculists come along and demand that women grow up, fib up, and take responsibility for their own lives, by bothering to get career competent educations and become FIPs as adults and not parasite off a man, depending on a man to make the tough life decisions and benefiting from the success, financial and existential, of a man. Of course, masculists have no patience with such hypocritical, fluffy feminists and aim to wipe them out, that is, effectively to exterminate them by totally rejecting them, so that as most men become masculisted, in brackets, the way most women today have been influenced by feminist ideas, close brackets, they will utterly reject fluffy, man-slaving, divorce-raping parasites and force them to rot on the shelf, utterly rejected by men, masculisted men, so that women are forced, in capital letters, by masculism to grow up, to fip up, to become adults, responsible adults, who do not have fluffy-like dependent personalities, behaving like irresponsible children who masculists spit on, having no respect for such women. So imagine that masculist and MGTOW ideas continue to spread and spread, so that men's lib ideas are in the air, and various masculisted politicians start thinking that the time is ripe for the establishment of GECs in the parliaments, so that the macroscopic issues to free men can start being addressed that require changes in the law to make them possible. For example, the big one of the legislation of the paternity rejection right. That will change everything, revolutionising society profoundly. Also, the OPTAB, obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births to block women's paternity fraud, and reforming the divorce courts so that they are men-fared, so that men don't get butchered in them, who get to keep their kids, so that joint custody is made the norm, so that alimony is thrown out, the owner of the house gets to keep it, etc. So these masculisted politicians then approach the women's rights committees in the parliaments, often referred to as the gender equality committees, which of course, in brackets, from a masculist point of view, are nothing of the sort. In fact, the very label is a hypocritical travesty, since they are the opposite of gender equality. They are in practice promoters of female power and privilege. For example, in the US, whenever the men's libbers pushed for joint custody in the divorce courts, these GECs opposed it. Or when it was proposed in those countries that have the military draft, that women be equally drafted, these female-dominant GECs opposed that too. In other words, the monoconscious feminists wanted equal rights for women, but rejected equal obligations for women, if these obligations were against women's interests. So, how are these masculisted male politicians going to convert the feminist-dominated GECs that exist at the present time into true GECs, that is, where half of their members are male masculists who push for men's lib, for the the OPTAB, reform of the divorce courts, for the fipping of women, for the creation of a FIP society, etc. I suspect, initially, the feminists in the feminist-dominated GECs will fight the masculist politicians outside, capital letters, the GECs, that is, within the party policy debates. The discussion as to the desirable nature of the GECs, their aims, their philosophy, will take place outside the GECs. But the feminist members of the GECs will obviously be concerned, since it will soon become clear to them that these masculist male politicians are proposing fundamental changes to the very nature of these committees. These feminists have been so brainwashed that gender oppression is a one-way street that they will see what the masculist politicians are trying to do as a zero-sum game. That is, if there is more masculist emphasis within the GECs, implies less emphasis on women's issues. What these monoconscious feminists fail to see is that the gender issues of both sexes need to be addressed if fundamental changes in society regarding gender roles are to be resolved. It takes vision and high intelligence to see this, that most feminists, monoconscious feminists, do not have. It was refreshing for me in 1980 to have chatted a bit with Betty Friedan, in brackets, mother of the second wave of feminism, with the publication of her book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963, close brackets, in Copenhagen at the United Nations Mid-Decade for Women conference, about the need for both sexes to be liberated. Friedan was a 180 IQ genius who readily agreed that women's careerism would liberate men from being man-slaves to fluffy parasites, and that feminism was only half the gender political story. Not many feminists today have her vision, and she was saying this to me 4 decades ago. So how are the masculist politicians going to occupy half of the committee's slots? They'll need to educate the monoconscious feminists and convert them into biconscious feminists. They could set up seminars in parliamentary sessions and have top masculist theorists and masculist leaders give talks on the nature of masculism and the need for the establishment of genuine GECs and not just feminist-dominated GECs that are nothing of the sort, in fact just the opposite, since they are only about women. That is true Orwellian doublethink. Public pressure in favour of establishing true GECs will rise and rise as half the population, that is men, demand them to be established. Since men can vote in bloc for their establishment, the political parties will be forced to listen. Masculist politicians can use their contacts with the media to present the masculist case, and in particular the masculist case for the establishment of true GECs, thus increasing political pressure on the parties to reform the feminist-dominated GECs, or risk losing their elections as masculist issues become ever more pressing among men, who apply an ever-growing pressure on politicians to liberate men from women's many decades-lasting gender crimes against men. Behind closed doors, these masculist politicians can apply strong psychological pressure on the more bigoted, monoconscious feminist politicians, telling them to their face, quote, "Learn some masculism, you monoconscious feminazi bigot," in brackets MFB, "or you will face the wrath of your male voters in your constituency. We masculist politicians are so fed up with your sexist, hypocritical bigotry that we tell the journalists what your true gender political values are. The reality is you don't give a shit about the welfare of men. Your monoconscious feminism is deeply misandrist and gynocentric. It teaches women nothing about how women oppress men, and in fact worse, due to the many decades-lasting gender crimes against men. Sooner or later, you'll be forced to convert yourself into a bi-conscious feminist, or your face will no longer be seen in the parliament, since you will have been voted out of office by millions of very angry, hateful, voting masculists in the population, half of the population. So if you want to survive as a politician, learn some masculism, you misandrist shit, or we masculist politicians will sabotage your careers, you misandrist, hated, feminazi bitches. This is a gender war, and we masculist politicians are very angry, hateful, and are aiming at fundamental reform of the GECs, which today are just examples of Orwellian doublethink. Don't underestimate male anger and hatred at what fluffies and fluffy feminists do to men. This is our decade, the decade of men's lib, in which men free themselves from man's slavery and divorce, rape, and other major gender crimes that women commit against men. Be conscious that the masculist volcano is rumbling and soon it will erupt." End quote. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Manslaves to Women, and e-textbook of 580 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.